In about 15 seconds. So it's my real delight today to introduce Dean Spears, our speaker. Dean is a development economist, an economic developer. He's associate professor of economics at University of Texas in Austin. He's an affiliate of the Population Research Center there. He's, I guess, founding co-director of arts. If you can give me a question, an answer period and explain to the few of you who don't know what arts is. His been very prolific in his research. One area in which he's researched a lot has to do with children, with the health, the nutrition status, the survival of the children. The second area has been having to do with climate pollution impacts, conditions of the environmental. But he's also been very concerned in a way more related to his topic today about the nature of demographic, social, economic interactions on a broad scale. He's published many articles and books, over 60 articles. I debated whether I would read the titles of all of them, but I thought said you'd rather hear it. 3 books, one of which is Where India Goes, which you may have heard of. It's not necessarily a forecast of future India goals, refers to defecation actually in this title. And this book has received a lot of attention, a lot of influence. Today, we're delighted to have been speaking about the recently. So let's welcome him.
Thank you so much for to be back here. So I am talking about book, which means that there's so much more in the book than I could talk about here today. So I have to be selective, and I'm going to be focusing because of the audience a little bit more on some of the facts about population science. But if you find that I don't touch on your favorite part of this, because every chapter in the book, there's someone here who knows more about it than I do. Then ask questions, and I hope you can look at them. But I'm sort of going to try to. I'll start with an overview because well, let's just begin. So for thousands of years, the size of the human population wasn't changing very fast. At the beginning of the Common Era, there were only around 300 million of us. Fewer than today live in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar or in the United States. But a few hundred years ago, that changed. We got better at keeping one another alive, and specifically better at keeping children alive through things like the germ theory of disease, sanitation, nutrition, vaccines. By the early 1800s, there were 1 billion of us. In the century after that, our numbers doubled to 2 billion people. And in the century after that, our numbers have quadrupled, doubled twice to today's 8 billion. And so those of us here today know a populous and growing world where lives have been getting better, where the absolute number of global poor people has been falling, where lifespans have been growing, where babies have been more likely to survive and they grow taller than they used to. But something new is happening, and all of that is about to change again, because while for decades the public worry has been overpopulation, all along birth rates have been falling. So population growth has been slowing. 1968 was the year when population growth was the fastest, and it's been slower ever since. And that population growth is projected to slow to 0 and for there to be a peak in the size of the world population. In some sense, we're already living between two peaks. The peak in the number of births already happened in 2012, with 146 million births worldwide, according to the UN. But the peak in the size of the population, after all, the working to age pyramid and mortality rates are still falling, isn't here yet. It's projected to come within a few decades. The UN puts it in the 2080s. Other groups like Vienna or IHME put it sooner. But either way, a child born today is likely to survive to the peak in the size in the world population. So what happens next? What happens after the peak? So that is what our book, After the Spike, is about. At the heart of what we're doing, or sort of a motivating exercise, is to use the if-then tools of population systems. So here on the wall behind me, you see population scientists and demographers have a number of tools where in a if-then sense, you specify possible futures for vital rates, for birth rates and death rates, and then see what happens to the population after that. So one of these tools is the cohort component model, where you sort of spell out everything for the birth rates and project what happens to a population. So what you see here are the sort of long-term or asymptotic results from a cohort component model that starts with the UNWPP median path, 2100, and then says, after that, let's ask them if-then or hypothetical questions. So if the world as a whole goes to a birth rate of 1.8 or 1.2 or 1.6, then what would population growth look like after that? And the basic thing I want you to see, which is not terribly surprising, that if the world goes to any of these birth rates below 2 children per 2 adults, then world population growth would be negative. And if there's something notable or surprising here about this, is that we're used to translating positive population growth rates into doubling times, but these, of course, are halving times. And halving times measured in years that seem really grappleable on the scale of a human lifetime. So that's one tool, the cohort component model. Another way of thinking about it that's interesting here is to use stable population theory, where we're asking about an equilibrium, and in an equilibrium where vital rates aren't changing, what's going to determine how fast the population changes? It's the birth rates, pre-adult death rates, and on how average what age people are when they have children. And so, try 6 different combinations of these things, and what do you see? I mean, the first thing you see is that it all looks pretty similar to what I showed you in the more computationally complex version. The second thing is, although it might not be immediately obvious, I'm using wildly different mortality scenarios here. 0% pre-adult mortality, all the way to pre-adult mortality for the world as a whole never gets any better than it is today, right? And so even spanning wildly different mortality scenarios, we're seeing that the big determinant between whether the world is shrinking, say, this fast or shrinking, say, that fast, is what the birth rate of the world as a whole is. And so, if you want to say, Dean, I know that guy, he writes papers about infant mortality in India. Like, how did I end up, working on this project? In some sense, this sentence here, fertility, not mortality, is the big uncertainty about the future of the world population. So another thing to think about here is that these percentage growth rates are not unprecedented. In fact, they're quite familiar, but with the opposite side from recent history. So if the world goes to an average like in Texas or Latin America today, 1.8, then that would be an average growth of negative, a halving time of 139 years. If the world goes to like China or Puerto Rico today, that would be a negative growth rate as fast. And if the world goes to around 1.6, then the world will be shrinking someday as fast as it's growing today. And so, that's an if-then statement. Let's zoom in a little bit on the if-then of that 1.6, because 1.6 is something that we have familiarity with. The US right now is an average of 1.6 children per 2 adults as a period fertility rate. Not to say that that's what we know is going to happen in the future, but it's an illustrative case to get started. What if birth rates around the world converge towards an average of 1.6? That would be like the US today. That would mean an increase in birth rates in some places, perhaps. Many countries are below 1.6, and a decrease in birth rates for other places. And going back to the whole cohort component model, if the world as a whole moves towards an average of 1.6, then the size of the world population would follow a path like this. So this is, again, following the UNWP's median path out to 2100, and then saying, if the world as a whole converges towards an average of 1.6 children per 2 adult, then this is what the future would look like. Now, do we have any reason to be confident that this is the exact thing that will be the future? Of course not. But these sorts of if-then hypothetical tools have an important place in population science because they help us quantify the magnitudes and sort of see something qualitative about the story. And I think the qualitative story we see here is that if that's what the future of parenting is for the world as a whole, then our populous times would just be a brief phenomenon or a spike in the language of the book. And more specifically, a birth rate of 1.6 isn't unprecedented. That's what the US is right now, and 2/3 of people around the world live in a country where the birth rate is 2. But if that's what happens for the world as a whole, then the future would be on this unprecedented path of depopulation for the world as a whole, which we haven't seen with him.
What year is the peak?
Sorry?
What year is the peak in this scenario?
Since we're just following the UN out to 2100, here the peak is 2084. Yeah, so other groups like IASA puts it in the 2070s, IHE puts it in the 2060s. It makes sense that some of you might write dissertations about which one of those are right and which ones of those are wrong. But I think on this scale, I'm going to say those all sort of agree. Now, again, there's no particular reason to believe that the future is going to be 1.6 instead of some other number. But if it's anything that's sort of in the ballpark of below 2, whether it's 1.8 like in Latin America or France, or 1.2 like in China or Chile, then we're going to see basically a similar story where the future is one of global depopulation, and sort of our populous times are something that happened as the past event. So that is the motivation for, is that a likely future, right? Everything I've said so far is, of this if-then form. So in our book, After the Spike, we made 3 big claims that we assess and present the evidence for. And the first is that we do think that, of course, not exactly that picture, but, qualitatively, global depopulation is a likely future, that no future is more likely, and that people worldwide choose to have too few children to replace their own generation, at least for some long run of time, and that over the long run, that would cause exponential population decline. I'll mainly talk about that today. But it also prompts another question, which the book is also substantial about, which is, should we welcome global depopulation? Should we sort of welcome it by default? Or would it be better if instead the population stabilized something? Perhaps now, so this is a graph that we show in the book when we pose the question. And the point that I'm trying to show when I show this graph is that when we're comparing depopulation against an alternative possibility of stabilization, we're not specifying any particular alternative possibility of stabilization. If your thought is that a good future would be for the size of the world population to peak, which it's almost certainly going to do no matter what, and then level out at some size smaller than today's, right? That would be a stabilization future. But any sort of stabilization future like that would require, once birth rates are below 2, to then rise for the world, which would be an unprecedented thing. So the question is, and we go through it, in 6 chapters, each tackling a different angle of it, is should we welcome depopulation by default, or should we be working towards a stabilization future? our conclusion, not to hide the ball, is that, considering the costs and benefits, a stabilized world population would be better overall than depopulating the future. Now, I want to stop right there and say, repeat it. A stabilized future would be better than a depopulating future. Over the long, when I introduced stabilization, I said over the long term at some size, not necessarily right now. And what I also want to say is that After the Spike is not a book about whether or how you or anyone else should. It's a book about whether we all should make parenting better and easier for those who want to choose it. We're not saying that anybody is making a mistake if they choose to parent or not to parent, but we might be making a mistake as a society if we're making it difficult for people who want to choose to parent. One of the things we're trying to do with this book is broaden the conversation around population change and low birth rates to bring more people in to that conversation who have values like ours, such as reproductive freedom, against global poverty or decarbonization. I think we've had some success bringing people into this conversation, and if people join us and disagree with us, then I'll at least be glad to have brought some more graphs to this conversation. And the third thing, which I probably won't have any time to talk about today, but just to tell you what the book's about, is to say that we're not here making policy recommendations because we think it's too soon to make policy recommendations, both because we're far from there being a consensus that stabilization is a future to work towards, but also because nobody yet knows how to stabilize a big populating world. That would be a big change, but humanity has made big positive changes to society before. As Jerry said, we went from few people using toilets and latrines to almost everybody using toilets and latrines. And we can, make big changes in the future again. So today I'll mainly, for this audience of population scientists, focus on the first claim, but insofar as there's time, I'll touch on evidence for all three. So, is sustained depopulation likely? Back to claim one, which is basically the same question of, are birth rates likely on average for the world as a whole to go below 2 and stay there for a while? Now, that's a different question from, should we be sure that birth rates will stay low? People sometimes ask me, how can you be sure? Of course you can't. Here's one project that tried to put some probabilistic numbers on it out for a few hundred years and came up with a quantification that there's a 90% chance that out to 2300, the world's birth rate would be below a replacement. Now, I don't know if it's 90 or 75 or 95%, but what I do think we should think is that it's likely that one likely future is that the birth rate of the world as a whole will below 2. I want to quickly give some, quick responses that I don't think are going to come up in this audience, but sometimes for other audiences I get, like, if birth rates are falling, won't they just stop at 2? But of course, we've seen they haven't. In many populations, they've gone below 2. People say, won't birth rates just reverse? Isn't there something natural or automatic about a birth rate of 2? You've seen the US Social Security Administration's projections have long, in the most recently they don't, but up until very recently, they just projected that the birth rate for the US would go back up to 2. We're not talking about the US in particular, but that's the sort of thing that people seem to believe there's something natural or absorbing about 2. No evidence for that. What about, don't some subpopulations and cultures have a lot of kids? And won't that necessarily mean that population growth has to be positive over the long term? People usually say something about the Amish when they ask this question. And we got this question so often, we put a paper in demography about it. The answer is no. Humans have culture and make choices and may leave the fold. And of course, what constitutes a high birth rate goes down, including amongst the Amish, for whom the birth rates have been falling. So that's that. I want to jump in a little bit more to things that I think might be more interesting here, of reasons that I see in the evidence to judge that sustained low birth rates are a likely global future. First, that the fall is broadly shared across time and space. Second, that there's a more robust trend for cohort birth rates than period. Third, I'm going to decompose it into childlessness and fertility amongst the pairs and show that there are multiple paths to low birth rates. And finally, I'm on sort of both sides of the debate about stated fertility preferences, but I'll mention it for a minute. So first, the fall of broadly shared. And the reason I think this is important is, that it suggests there's something robust that we're seeing about the fall in birth rates, that it happens in various different places. The low replacement period birth rates, although in the US popular media, you sometimes hear it talked about as something that's only now emerged. This is a trend that's been, ongoing for a long time. Here's from WPP. This is 25-year timestamps, and I'm just wanting you to see the fall in countries' birth rates has been going on for a long time. So now most countries, most people live in a place where it's below 2. This is another way of visualizing the same evidence. You see sort of the fall in the world total fertility rate. And I think sometimes people are surprised that the fraction of the world with the TFR below 2 did not just suddenly pop up 10 years ago, but has been increasing over time. Already by 1980, 20% of people lived in a country with a birth rate below 2. And if you go back further in time, you see evidence that the decline is even longer lasting than that. France was at 3 in 1900, estimate, insofar as we know anything, we know that the decline has been longer than that. We see that that this is broadly geographically shared, including in some places. Every US state has been below 2, which means that that's true for the Trump states and true for the Biden states, and every Canadian province and every prefecture of Japan, true when looking only amongst US, Blacks, whites, or Hispanics. My own expertise is about India. Part of me sort of noticing this was writing a paper with Jerry about family sizes in India, which required me to look at different variables in the DHS. And you see that, India is not only the world's most populous country, but it's the world's most populous country with a birth rate below 2 now. And I think that's interesting. It's not something that everybody expected. It really challenges a lot of the narratives about why birth rates are low. So you hear people say that birth rates are low, that the problem is the gender revolution, too many women working, or the problem is people aren't getting married, or the problem is the decline in religion. But India is a place where, for starters, Latin America is a place where 90% of people tell Pew that they're Christian, and we still see a birth rate of 1.8. But India is a place where marriage remains almost universal. Childbearing tends to start at young ages. Only 40% of women work in the paid labor force. We still see people having a birth rate of below 2. Basically, people, to give a stylized fact, as an economist would say, people get married, start a childbearing career, and then have permanent contraception surgery in their mid-20s. And so I don't think that this means that the sort of conflict between career and family stories that we might hear about Europe or the US is necessarily wrong for those places. I think instead what it tells us is that we're dealing with a convergent global phenomenon that has many pathways, or if you prefer, many headwinds against larger families. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I'm trying to create a sense that it is natural to think that this might be a likely future if we're seeing it happen in different ways in different places. Now, of course, sub-Saharan Africa is the one big world region where birth rates are still above 2, right now at 4, but you see that they have been falling there. WPP projects that they will continue to. To me, if I can just say a word about it, I think that makes sense to expect that, because what I'm doing here is looking at some of the most populous sub-Saharan African countries in their most recent DHSs and comparing them to Uttar Pradesh in India in its DHS from 20 and 30 years. And at a very rough level, take off your glasses if necessary, you see that female secondary education or female literacy in a lot of these African DHSs is not so different from it was in Uttar Pradesh 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And the birth rate is not so different. And so this gives us, let me say, some rational basis to think that the birth rate in Africa might continue to fall as these human development things continue. Okay, reason two, that the cohort birth rates show, to my eye, it looks like a more robust downward trend. So we don't have evidence on this from everyone because it's evidentially complicated. But here we're just taking from the human fertility database. So the gray dashed line is cohort completed fertility, and I've matched up a cohort to the period rate in the year where they turned 30. And what I want you to see, what I see in these lines is that the dashed cohort lines seem more robustly downward sloping where we can see them than the period lines, which seem more wiggy. I was talking with Irma earlier about how, we do see this, trend up in the US, just turning downward there at the end. And so, we can put whatever weight on that evidence that you want to. But when I look at this, I see the cohort lines going down. Additionally, another question you can ask is, what evidence do we see of a reversal? Right. So the way that this graph asks that question is to say, for every country, which is the cohort that has had the lowest cohort completed fertility, right? And then that's the horizontal axis. So what's the lowest cohort completed fertility has ever been in there? And the vertical axis is what's cohort completed fertility of the most recent. Right? And so if there were a lot of rebound for birth rates going back up, then we'd see a lot of these dots be above the line, right? And if in every country they were at their lowest cohort ever, then we'd see a lot of the dots be on the line. And to my eye, the dots are pretty close to the line and not really rebounding. Again, the US is an interesting case here, but we see in general, a lot of countries, their cohort completed fertility is pretty close to as low as it's ever been. So we're not seeing big rebounds. Another way of looking at that is to say, amongst the countries where cohort completed fertility in the HFD, so birth cohorts since the 1950s, have ever gone below 1.9, for how many of them has it been subsequently reversed and gone back up against 2? And you're not waiting for me to click. The answer is none of them, right? From 0 to 26. So that doesn't mean that a reversal isn't possible. I'm not trying to claim that it's possible, but I'm saying that's not the sort of thing we see the evidence of in the record. The third reason to judge that sustained low birth rates are likely in the future is back to what I was saying about India, about there being multiple paths. Here, multiple paths is in the sense of childlessness. So especially in the US media, you basically hear this low birth rates described as being about an increasing childlessness. But we can take completed cohort fertility and decompose it in the sense of a Kitagawa decomposition into the fraction who are parents and average lifetime fertility amongst people who are parents who have children versus the zeros, right? So how much of the decline is about the zeros and how much of the decline is about the number of children people have who are parents? And we do this for both the countries in the human fertility database and for districts in India that are below the baseline. Districts in India, which might have a population of 4 million, for example, for Sitapur, are as populous as many European countries. And the answer that we get is that there's some real heterogeneity. That at the same level of low cohort birth rates, there's a lot of variation in the rate of childlessness. In particular, for Indian districts, childlessness is pretty low, even for places that are below 2 in completed cohort fertility, which means that, especially in Indian districts, you can see it better here. The reason that that fertility is low is because people are being parents and parents are having few children. So in these graphs, for human fertility database country cohorts and for Indian district cohorts, we see the horizontal axis is cohort fertility, the vertical axis is average cohort fertility throwing out the zeros or conditional on having parents. And what we see is that so if the dots were way above the lines, then that's childlessness being a big part of it. If the dots are right on the line, then that's that the story is mainly about the average birth rate amongst people who are parents. And there are a few things you see here. One is that the Indian story is a little bit different. They're closer to the line, right? So childlessness is low. But two is that there are an awful lot of country cohorts or district cohorts where even looking only amongst Paris, you see birth rates below 2, which tells us that the story can't be all about childlessness, right? Because we're seeing birth rates low enough to eventually, if for the world as a whole, cause depopulation, even if there were no childlessness whatsoever. So I think it's relevant to our question of what is likely, because again, it tells us that there are these multiple pathways, a pathway about childlessness, or a pathway about children amongst people who aren't parents. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk so much about stated fertility preferences. I got to say, I sort of have papers on both sides of, this is me, on papers on sort of both sides of how informative these survey questions are. I will say that if you look at the VHS, you see looking at Uttar Pradesh, which is a very disadvantaged state, young women there saying they want below an average of 2 children. It's been a thing that's been in the popular media, like, is this about mobile phones or the internet or something like that? You see it whether you look at people who do or don't have mobile phones. So you may take this evidence and the evidence that these stated preferences are generally falling, whatever you want to take them for, as a piece of evidence that birth rates can be falling. But what about, is it likely that policy will well, what could policy be? Well, one form of policy is spending money. Children are expensive, but can policy make them more affordable? We hear about child tax credits, or maybe if we invest in just the right way in a social safety net, that will increase birth rates. And if you ask me, I think investing more in children in the social safety net is a great idea, but I think it won't surprise many people in this room to know that the evidence suggests that in a long-term way for cohort birth rates, the evidence that we see doesn't seem to suggest that spending money in this sort of way is going to be as powerful as people think it is. Sometimes I like to say, would you marry somebody different for a $5,000 tax credit? And nobody has ever yet said yes to me yet, which makes me wonder how much people are going to rewrite their autobiographies for that level of funding. What about not so nice policies like coercion? It's important to talk about this because it's not just a conceptual possibility, but something that we actually see happening. Our take after the spike is that although we need to reject this sort of coercion and taking away people's reproductive freedom on ethical grounds, we also need to pause and reject it on empirical grounds and not give the controllers and the coercives the credit for being as powerful as people think they are. So, for example, I teach in Texas, where there's been ever more restrictive bans on reproductive health care, and that has harmed people's life. But what it hasn't done has caused reversal in birth rates back up to 2. In fact, Texas' most recent total fertility rate is lower than in any year before the pandemic. So that's not what we see happening. What about even more extreme policies like China's one-child policy or Romania's Decree 770? There are large literatures here that I can't get into now, but I think there's good reason to think that these policies, that China's one-child policy, sometimes you read in the newspaper, China, comma, where birth rates are low, comma, because of the one-child policy. And I think that goes too fast. That probably the one-child policy had many impacts on China, including people's lives. But if you look at other countries in Asia with similar socioeconomic development over the same time period, you see birth rates falling by comparable amounts. They fell by more in India over the same period. They fell by more in Latin America over the same period. So probably China would still have low birth rates, even with that. So we, in addition to rejecting coercion for ethical reasons, also think that governments are probably not going to be able to coerce their way out of depopulation. And that global depopulation is probably the most likely future for some important time period. Nobody has a blueprint to avoid it. Now, I'm at 12:40. I'll stop in 5 minutes for questions. I just want to, briefly visit some of the things that, I basically talked about the first 2 chapters of this 12-chapter book. And so I want to briefly visit some of the rest of it, why we think that a stabilized world population someday be better than a depopulation future. That starts with talking about the reasons why not. And for many people, the reasons why not starts with the environment and the fact that we should welcome depopulation to get us off the hook for some of our environmental challenges. And yes, humans are and have been polluting and have caused environmental challenges. Yes, if there were fewer of us all along, then there wouldn't be as much carbon dioxide in the air right now in 2025. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution forward is fewer of us. China in 2013 had this terrible particulate pollution situation called the air apocalypse, known around the world, that was off the charts. And then what happened next? Well, in the 10 years after that, China's population grew by 50 million people. That's as large as many countries. And particle air pollution fell by half. Particle air pollution for the world as a whole fell as the world grew by 750 million. Not everywhere, not in India, where they haven't made the policy choices to really address it. And I think that's what's important. What happened in China is that they stood against the particle air pollution, said that they turned off coal plants and required firms to use cleaner technology. The way to fight the destructive human environmental activity is to fight the destructive activity. We say after the spike, not the humans. When I was a kid, I heard about the hole in the ozone layer as the big problem. My kids don't contribute to the hole in the ozone layer. That's because the Montreal Protocol is 87 and CF6. Now, when I say this, people often tell me, but climate change is so exceptionally important. Wouldn't every little bit help? But I want to be very clear about just how little of a bit anything that could happen about the size of the population could be on the timescales that are relevant to our urgent climate challenges. Right? So this compares what we consider to be a plausible depopulation future because the most ludicrously large possible stabilization future, which essentially couldn't happen and would have required birth rates to have already gone up. And even so, on the time scale relevant to decarbonization, it just doesn't make a difference in the size of the population during the decades when we need to be decarbonized. So yes, population change could come fast on the level of generations, but on the level to years and decades, we're not going to fight for change that much. Another thing to say, that we have to talk about, and we were able to get into more depth in the book, is that parenting is unfair, society is unequal, parenting has often been unfair in reality. Society is unequal even when parenting is not involved, and not everybody can get pregnant. And maybe one reason to welcome depopulation would be if we thought that stabilizing the population had to mean rolling back progress towards gender equity or taking away reproductive freedom. And after the spike, we say it doesn't have to, that it is possible to build a future with an average birth rate of 2 and continue progress towards gender equity. And not automatic if we say it's possible. Say it's an important thing on humanity's to-do list, possibly before any of the rest of us. And one argument that it's possible is that in all of these countries, abortion is legal, contraception is available, and becoming a parent is legally a free choice. But we see that the birth rate is very different amongst them, more than twice in France what it is in South Korea. And that's because say yes to reproductive freedom and access to health. But that doesn't tell you everything that matters about what path a society is on. And, other things are different about France and South Korea. A fairer society could be possible and to choose that alongside a birth rate on an average of 2. In chapter 4, we get into this in great length, just to give you one data point about it. Here's OECD countries, which are more economically advanced countries. Here's the gender wage gap. And what we see is really not much of a relationship with the birth rate, which communicates to us that, yeah, it could be possible to build a fairer society, not an average birth rate of 5 or 4 or 3, but with an average of 2. Except I've left something out, which is I left off South Korea, which is the country where the most and the lowest birth rate, which makes a lot of sense, right? I think one of the things that's gotten us here is that we've had these structures that say there are people who do important work, people who do care work, and loaded all of the work onto some of the population. And so it makes sense that some of the population was going to say no, thank you. And so, there's a long conversation that we all need to have about what sort of future that we want. But before anyone asks more of women, the place to start is by asking more of men to contribute to making the next generation. No, not everybody can get pregnant, but of course, there's much more that goes into making a person those traits. I am essentially out of time. So I've not left myself the time on purpose, although I think it's some of the most interesting stuff. Please read the book. This is an explicit advertisement to talk about, we think that stabilization is a good idea because other people's lives are win-win. They're good for them and good for you. Why good for you? Well, part of it is that other people needing and wanting, you need and want. It's part of how you get it. If someday someone you love needs some sort of specialized medical treatment, it will be more likely to exist in a world where other people don't get something similar. The thing that's perhaps most different about our work and what other people are saying about this is that we consider not only people on the supply side of the economy and people on the demand side of the economy, but people in the social welfare, which is an economist way of saying, what's good? There's a big field at the intersection of academic philosophy and academic welfare economics called population ethics, which has confronted the question of how to understand goodness when population varies. If Abe, Beam, Rao, and Chen are the only 3 people who are going to live under 2 policies, it sort of makes sense to all of us that you want Abe, Beam, Rao, and Chen to do well. But what if under one policy, Daniela will exist, under another policy, Daniela won't exist, right? Well, that's, if nothing else, my message to you is a question that there are many peer-reviewed papers and books addressing, and that I wish there were more engagement between the academic population science community and the academic population ethics community. Mike and my take is that what we take away from this literature is that it shows us that more good lives is better, that it's better if there's more good in the world, other things being equal, including the goodness in good lives, and worse if there is less. And that's one important reason why a depopulated future would be worse than a stabilized future. Now, I want to be very clear. I have announced this right here. I haven't argued for it, but we do in chapter 8, and we do in an appendix. And there's a much larger literature than that. And even if you were to come to agree with us about this question of better or worse, that wouldn't excuse coercion or taking away people's freedom to choose to be a parent or not to be a parent, nor would any environmental or economic consequences of other people either. The thing we talk about in the book is that it's valuable if people choose to be a nurse in a disadvantaged area and make the world better by saving lives. And perhaps we want policy to encourage people to choose that sort of thing. But nobody should think that government should force people or help people to do it. There's just no conflict between saying that we have to respect choice and it matters for future good. I've only advertised that this is something that we get into in the book, and I hope you'll look at it. And I won't at all talk about what we talk about in the last part of the book, other than to say not to trust people who say that they know the solution. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Why don't you just take questions, right?
Please.
You say a little bit about the spacing patterns in India, whether it's that the spacing between children has grown or whether women are ending fertility earlier.
Women are ending fertility early. So like instead of, so yeah, it's interesting. We have a paper that we're just now working on that more women in the most recent Indian DHS live with a parent-in-law than in the DHS 10 years earlier. Even though, I'm sorry, more pregnant women, that's the word that needed in that sentence. More pregnant women live with a parent-in-law than before. Because conditional on being pregnant, you're younger because you're not seeing those higher parity pregnancies. Which is interesting because, you know, for all family structures, we see women reporting more decision-making say, but in a decomposition sense, the increase in decision-making say in pregnancy is smaller than it would have been if this weren't the case because more people are living with their infants. So yeah, I bet there is an increase in spacing. I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. But I know it's true that like the extent in age of the average childbearing career is compressing more downwards. Yes?
So I'm just trying to get my head around the time scale on this, because when you show that, you know, at the 1,000-year scale, it looks really dramatic. We're headed towards depopulation very quickly. But when you stretch it out a little in one of your subsequent slides, the bottom line is that the world will have at least as many people as it has today for the next 125 years.
I think that's probably, I mean, I think we're definitely asking people to consider well in advance, what sort of longer term future. I mean, one way of thinking about the pace of change is if the world goes to an average of 1.5, is kind of like Europe today. The 115 richest countries, according to the World Bank, have an average of about 1.5. Then the rate of decline would be about 10% per decade, or about 2/3 per century. Now, one question you might ask is, why talk about the long-term future? Don't we have so many urgent and pressing problems to talk about? And I say, yes, we do have many urgent and pressing problems to talk about, and we should talk about those too. And we should talk about the long-term future. I think we are, 60 years, so 60 years from now is when the UN projects that the peak would be. I don't know if it's going to be exactly 60 years from now. 60 years ago is when you first started seeing the slightest glimmers of attention from policymakers to climate change, like LBJ giving a speech to Congress. If somebody 60 years ago had come out and said, climate change is coming, what we need to do is immediately get rid of the internal combustion engine, that would have been a very silly thing and discrediting thing to say, right? But it's good that people were starting to talk about climate change 60 years ago, build social movements and awareness, do research, build academic departments, because we know more now than we would have if that happened. That's what we're advocating for here. Maybe that wasn't your question. Is that your question?
No, that was my question. But I guess my final comment would be that 125 years is a long time. It could be we'll have external wounds by then. People will be happy to have more children. I just don't. It's hard for me to imagine the technological solution to come up with.
It could be. I mean, one of the things that, so you brought up sort of assisted reproductive technology that's like even greater than the assisted reproductive technology that we have today. What if you were saying external wounds? What if you could just push a button and have a baby? I think for a lot of people that would be wonderful. My family went through miscarriages and other people went through worse. I personally am skeptical that that would cause a huge increase in birth rates all the way up to the level of 2 in places where it's below it. In part because as challenging as pregnancy and miscarriage and childbirth and the health risks of that can all be for some people, there's also many more decades of effort and cost to go into making children people are thinking about. So of course, we don't know what effect that would have on the birth rate, but my sense is that even if there were magical assisted reproduction, it would still be the case that birth rates below 2 are all in the future. Oh, yeah,
No, yeah. Very interesting. And I wanted to ask you about, the tension between the global and the national. And, you see a lot of heterogeneity, these things, stuff like that. And when you're looking at the national, population growth is also affected by migration. So, what's your take in the role of migration? I was just thinking about Canada. Canada, for grade 1.36, has a active immigration policy, and like that. So, what's your take on migration in or immigration in even things out across or trade?
That's a great question. And I want to say like this book really isn't about the population of any one given country. And in part that's because this is a situation where it's paradoxically easier to say something sensible about a longer term future than a shorter term future. I mean, for a shorter term future, what happens in lots of countries is going to be immigration politics. And these sorts of tools don't tell you much about that. I think in the longer term future, the migrants have to come from somewhere. And Latin America is below 2, India is below 2, Africa is not below 2 yet, but falling. So there's sort of question of where the migrants would come from in the long term. At the global level, if you look at, for example, the WPP, their median projection versus their no migration projection, where they shut off migration, which means that not only do you not have people moving, but then you don't have people moving and like adopting the vital rates in those places. You get basically the same, very similar size of the population between them. Of course, it's differently allocated across places, but the total is pretty similar. So no shade on migration research, but I don't have anything to say about it.
It was really, so you made an ethical and an empirical case against coercion to lead to these stabilization possibilities. What do you see in the space of policy in terms of something like libertarian paternalism, something a nudge towards greater control, looks more politically feasible with the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't, I mean, so so you referred to libertarian paternalism, this idea from Thaler and Sunstein that you can sort of make small changes that still preserve people's freedom. Of course, these are often glossed as nudges, which I mean, sort of connotes that it can be a small change, like, changing where we put the healthy food in the cafeteria line versus where we put the desserts. And my sense is that this isn't a small thing, that, the headwinds against choosing more families are large. I mean, I think this is a generations project, that, if there's any reason to think that future birth rates might be higher than they are, it would have to be something to do with, future people's fertility preferences don't exist yet because future people don't exist yet. And if we work hard for a few generations to build options for parenting that are fairer and better supported, as part of a society and state that do more to share that, then maybe future generations of children will grow up and see that parenting looks like a better option. And maybe they'll have preferences to want more children, and maybe we'll do more to share that. But I think it's not going to be a fast solution. It's going to be a generations level project, which is another reason to be talking about it now.
I would like to hear a little bit more about your reading of all the research for the decline in fertility, because you seem to be very skeptical of any of the proposed explanations, and yet it's still declining. Are you saying it's just mysterious, or that they're all right and it's too complicated for us to understand? Or, what is your understanding of what has happened?
The conceptual difference when everybody's right and everybody is wrong. I think that it's not one size fits all. That like you see people sort of have these monocausal explanations, and that's what I feel skeptical about. In the book, what we say is that insofar as there's a governing or generalizing explanation, It's that the opportunity cost of having a child has gone up. Part of the world being a better place with more options, more freedom, more education, more jobs, more stuff, better video games, is that whatever is competing with having a kid is probably getting better. In some sense, that's a tautological explanation, not an actual explanation. So, I think, I sort of joked at the beginning that I've got Caldwell sitting here. And I think that, that's been important in some places and times. I think in India, there is still a quantity quality story that's going on in terms of how people think about investing in education. I don't think these same, but on the other hand, if you think about like Sweden, where it's fallen from 1.8 a decade ago to 1.4 in the more recent data, I think that's got to have other consequences. That's not, for example, because people in Sweden only now got access to modern contraception. So I think it is sort of a convergent outcome of all of things going. If you want to call that everybody's right or everybody's wrong, let you judge.
But does that then mean that there's no real point in trying to understand it, or?
No, it means we need to try harder.
Hard, okay, that's.
Yeah. It means that the question, we're not done. Let's get more people working on this.
No, just one kind of question, it's like, is somebody else? Okay,
Well, no, I mean, all right, very interesting, Lee, thank you so much. It's great to have you here. So my question is, like Emilio picked on the differences, he asked about the differences, the national differences, right? I want to ask you about the differences within countries. So in the debate about low fertility, what we see in the media, it's like this debate on like pushing for this alarmist thing of like, wow, birth rates have to, increase, but that's a very specific type of fertility, right? It's two parents, families, unborn, straight parents, etc., etc. When we know that that's not, we know that there are differences there. So what's your take, or how do those differences fit into the arguments that you are proposing, or the argument of the book in terms of stratification of childbearing norms, for example?
I'll answer with reference to India, which is the place that I know about. And there's been some, toxic politics over the decades. Especially Hindu politicians saying that Muslim birth rates are too high, for example. And what we need is, higher Hindu birth rates in part to counteract the high Muslim birth rates. But, part of what we're seeing as birth rates fall is, this is a very, a percent count bounded below by zero, right? And so as the mean is going down, the variance is going down also. And the average birth rate, the difference between Hindus and Muslims, or between Uttar Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, or between Dalits and general castes, is lower than it has ever been before. So these famous differences across subnational social groups and birth rates, at least in India, are getting smaller. Now, whether that smaller difference translates into a bigger politics of conflict is, somebody else's topic to say. I've heard somebody say that academic politics is so much more fierce than national politics because the differences are so much smaller. Maybe that's not true anymore in national politics, but it's something that you used to hear. So I can't go beyond the fact, but I do know that in the case of India, A, these differences are really storied and contested, and B, they're smaller than they.
Okay, let's wrap up. Thank you very much.